Once again, our lives have been touched by the enormous dangers of exploration. I recall Walter Cronkite's words as he sought to explain the deep mourning which overwhelmed our nation in 1986 when Challenger was destroyed. The space program had begun in the golden age of America in the 20th century. It was part of the legacy of JFK. But vastly more important is the exploration of space is as a collective representation of who we are as a people. It is about our human potential and our seamless, boundless future. We are formed by the past, we live in the present, but our best dreams and our best hopes are with the future, a future we have chosen to make better for all. I would be remiss if I did not ask you to join one another to mourn the loss of Air Force Colonel Rick D. Husband, Navy Captain David M. Brown, Navy Commander William C. McCool, Navy Commander Laurel Clark, Air Force Lieutenant Michael P. Anderson, Israeli Air Force Colonel Ilan Ramon, and Indian civilian astronaut Kalpana Chawla. Please join me in a moment of silence. It's a very great honor today to introduce one of Israel's best-known journalists. And for many years, Tom Segev has been writing a weekly column for Haaretz, Israel's leading daily newspaper. His column deals mainly with the politics of culture and with human rights, but I'm sure that he would say he gets to write about whatever he wants, perhaps. Tom Segev has become one of Israel's most often quoted journalists in international media. He was born in Jerusalem during the last years of the British Mandate, which was the focus of his award-winning One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate. I brought all the books in, sort of like that they really do exist and they're very large. So here is One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate. This book was selected by the New York Times Editor's Choice as one of the best books of the year 2000. It also received the National Jewish Book Award in 2001 and the JDC Katsky Award for Archival Excellence. Segev studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he received his undergraduate degrees in history and political science. And he completed his doctoral degree at Boston University in history. Indeed, it was his first book, I brought that in too, 1949, The First Israelis, which became literally overnight a bestseller when it was published in Hebrew originally in 1984, and then was translated into many other languages immediately thereafter. In this book, Segev used a series of declassified official documents for the first year of the Jewish state. And that archival research projected him into the center of a national uproar and made his work one of the cornerstones of what is often called Israel's new historiography. This was followed in 1988 by an extraordinary book titled Soldiers of Evil, which is a study of the death camp commandants that arose from his doctoral dissertation. I remarked earlier this morning that I would like to have that book back in print because it is so important in terms of the issues of human evil. That book won the Masua Prize in Holocaust Studies, and it was followed by this extraordinary book, The Seventh Million, The Israelis in the Holocaust, which was published in 1991. This won him international praise and was also made into a two-part television documentary that was shown in several countries. His most recent book, and I brought that in as well, is smaller, entitled Elvis in Jerusalem, PostZionism and the Americanization of Israel. Well, it's smaller. Now, what characterizes Tom Segev's work? Because archivists, and there are several of my colleagues who work in archives and they'll know this, archivists are exceedingly dull and boring. But Tom Segev has an extraordinary writing ability. Those of you who have read his columns, I think, know that he takes very controversial positions. But those of you who have picked up The First Israelis or The Seventh Million or One Palestine Complete know that he has this extraordinary ability to tell a story, and always it is told in the frame of people's lives. As we were walking in, one of my friends, Peter Melnick, pointed out that what you get from Segev's work is an extraordinary feeling about crisis, yes, change, historical difference, but also how people live through those crises, live through those events. Tom Segev's recent project, or the project that he is working on, is on 1967. Not just the war, but the entire year. Segev has held academic guest appointments at the Hebrew University. He has been a senior fellow at the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University. And in 2002, he has been the Stewart Short-Term Fellow of the Humanities Council and the History Department of Princeton University. Colleagues and friends, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Tom Segev here to Santa Barbara, to our campus, to our community, to talk on Beyond Arafat and Sharon. Please welcome now Tom Segev.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Yesterday I had the chance to walk around a little bit in Santa Barbara, and I went into a bookshop and I came across a book called The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Middle East Conflict. As I went through the pages of that book, I immediately realized that I still have a lot to learn. And I'm learning, I'm trying. It is not easy. Those of you who follow the news from Israel know that one is exposed constantly to an unending chain of very dramatic events. One constantly has to reevaluate one's views and cope with surprises and disappointments and rather grotesque situations. We are also a very moody society. I think that's why, one reason why we are so moody is because we are constantly exposed to our local dramas. So we very often tend to move from the depth of despair to the heights of elation and back again very quickly and rapidly. Today, of course, Israel is once again in one of those states of national grief over the death of Ilan Ramon. Ilan Ramon was a pilot in the Israeli Air Force. Now, when you say in Hebrew, the Israeli Air Force, these two words, Chel HaAvir, in itself have heavy emotional meaning, a symbolic meaning. The Israeli Air Force means an elite, not necessarily and not only a social elite, but also an elite of quality and achievement. We have the term in Hebrew, hatovim latayis, which means the best to the Air Force. And that is something people grow up on, believing that the best Israelis, the highest achievement an Israeli can achieve is to serve in the Air Force. And that is, of course, also part of the American dream, which is so typical of the Israeli society and has been so typical, especially in the last, say, 20 years or so. Ilan Ramon, in particular, is also the son of Holocaust survivors. So once again, we never escape the Holocaust. Almost in every thing you mentioned from Israel, you will always come back to the Holocaust. So that adds symbolism to his death. He also died on a mission of peace, on a mission of scientific research. So that adds a lot of symbolism to his death. And so when I followed the story yesterday, I also couldn't avoid thinking, and naturally the Israeli media today mentions again and again that the first pieces of the debris fell on the state of President Bush, and they fell at a little place called Palestine, Texas. So all these things add a lot of symbolism to this story, very, very heavy symbolism. And I think that this is one of the things that makes life in Israel really is characteristic of life in Israel, that we never escape symbolism. And I think that you cannot really understand Israel without taking into account the fact that we are constantly living under a very heavy load of symbolism. And I think it is this kind of load which we carry with us, which that explains in a great deal why, what we are and who we are and why we are the way we are. It is symbolism and it is a lot of emotion. All these things are very, very emotional and embedded in some historical background, which Israelis are very, very much aware of. And I think that it is in this sphere, the sphere of psychology and emotion, that you must also understand the most recent elections in Israel. I will try to convince you today that Israelis re-elected Ariel Sharon voting not with their heads, but with the guts. It was an emotional election, and it was out of emotional reasons that they re-elected Sharon. I'm saying this because prior to the elections, opinion polls showed that people, a large majority of people in Israel, hold very different views from those of Sharon. For example, 70% of all Israelis support the dismantlement of at least some settlements on the occupied territories. That is not what Sharon supports. 70% is a very high percentage of the population. A similar percentage of the population does not believe that Sharon can solve the economic crisis of Israel. So rationally, when they came to think of it, and when they talk about it rationally, they are aware of the fact, and they know that under Sharon, Israel has come to one of the country's worst periods in the country's history, in fact. The combination of the economic crisis with terrorism. We have an unemployment rate today of 10%. And of course, the acts of terrorism never stop. In the last 2 years, about 700 Israelis were killed by terrorist actions. Nearly 2,000 Palestinians have been killed. And that means that we are rapidly approaching the number of the people killed in the September 11th disaster. So these are the proportions of things we are experiencing all in the last 2 years. And so, thinking rationally, you would think that people will tell a government, well, you had your chance, you blew it, and we want another prime minister. We vote for somebody else. And this is what they say when you ask them in polls unrelated to the elections. And still, they voted for Sharon. They did not only vote for Sharon, they massively voted for Sharon. It is a landslide victory which he received. And so the question really comes up, how to explain that? That is a very strange thing. It is very difficult to explain. And perhaps I should have said at the beginning that I might not be able to explain everything to you, because Israel is very, very difficult to understand and even more difficult to explain. But I think that the election results reflect the effect of terrorism on the Israeli society. Terrorism kills the ability and the willingness of democratic societies to act rationally. This is not unlike something you experienced in this country after September 11th, and it is definitely something which we experience in Israel. Terrorism in Israel has become part of the everyday experience. And this happens at a time when Israelis are much more individualistic than before. People in Israel today know that terrorism does not threaten the existence of the state. It threatens every individual. It threatens me. I have to decide whether I go on a bus to the shopping center. I have to decide, or somebody has to decide, whether to send his daughter to ballet class, or maybe she better stays at home. Do we go out? Don't we go out? It is an everyday experience, and it is particularly, the effect of terrorism is particularly strong because we have become such an individualistic society. Naturally, then, we take terrorism very, very personally. And this is what people took with them when they went to vote. Now, terrorism and the effect of terrorism is a relatively new situation to us. Until 2 years ago, when the present Intifada started, during Oslo, or during the days of the peace or the years of the peace process, it seemed as if Israel is approaching a new development in its history towards becoming a multicultural democracy, and many people began to talk about the first signs of a post-Zionist situation, meaning that the Zionist dream has been fulfilled by and large. And by the way, it has been a big success story. Israel represents one of the most dramatic success stories of the 20th century. So people were able to say, this country is strong, its existence is no longer in danger, it is in fact a nuclear power, it has a viable democracy, viable bureaucracy, more or less sound economy. So the country is strong, is there, is no longer in question. Within 10 or 15 years, Israel will be the largest Jewish community in the world. So in that sense, you might also say Zionism has really been fulfilled. And in those days, until 2 years ago, it seemed as if the conflict with the Palestinians is about to be settled. Not that everybody believed in peace, but the general feeling was that we are somehow getting the conflict under control and we are managing the conflict towards some kind of settlement. And hence, people felt that this is no longer the major problem. The existence of Israel is no longer the major problem. Life is becoming much more normal, which really is the essence of the Zionist dream. Normal life for the Jews in a Jewish state. In those days, the major question of the public discourse was how to keep Israel both Jewish and democratic. I think it is a sign of more security and more maturity that the Israeli public was at all able to raise that question, admitting that there might be tension between being Jewish and being democratic, and looking for ways how to solve this potential tension between Jewishness and democracy. And what the question really meant was how to make sure that the Arab minority in Israel is no longer discriminated against, how to make the Arabs in Israel equal citizens. I'm talking about Israeli citizens who are Arabs. I know that sometimes in America, I think it is politically correct to use the term Israeli Palestinians, but that is terribly confusing. So I'm not talking about the Palestinians who live on the occupied territories. I'm actually talking about Israeli citizens who are Arabs. They form about 20% of the population. So that is a very large minority, and the question came up, how do we finally make these people into equal citizens? That was really what the question meant. How do we make Israel both Jewish and democratic? So that's that was a relatively new kind of issue. It caused tremendous discussion in books and lots of argument and how to do it. But that was a totally new kind of issue, and that I think is an indication of how Israel became, or this is one reason why people began to talk about a post-Zionist situation. This is a post-Zionist thought. The assumption is that Zionism has fulfilled its goal, and where do we go from here? Still, we had traditional problems, the tension between Ashkenazic Jews and non-Ashkenazic Jews, the tension between religious Israelis and non-religious Israelis. But all countries have tensions and social tensions and problems, nothing special about that. Everybody thought that somehow we would solve it. The atmosphere that was created in those days was very, very different from the traditional Israeli Zionist atmosphere. People began to think of themselves as individuals. They were no longer living for this or that ideology or for any ideology at all, not even for the Zionist ideology. They were not living for the past, not for the future. They were living for life itself, very much in the tradition of the American now culture. And in fact, this new tendency was part of the Americanization of Israel. At the same time, the whole atmosphere in the whole society became more open, more pluralistic, more tolerant, which meant, among other things, that Israelis finally began to tolerate Jewish alternatives to life in Israel, which means we no longer looking down on Jews who don't live in Israel. There was a time, some of you people may remember, that when you come to Israel, the first question they ask you is, why don't you live in Israel? And we don't ask that anymore. In fact, it is legitimate for Israelis not to live in Israel, because we have realized that the Israeli identity is so strong that people retain their Israeli identity even if they don't live in Israel. They can live in Santa Barbara and still be Israelis. And that is a relatively new realization. It is definitely a post-Zionist realization. And there were lots of other indications that all seemed to prove something which for many people was very offensive and very difficult to accept, that Israel is in fact moving towards a post-Zionist phase of development. And then Oslo exploded in our faces and the Intifada began, and we all felt, I think more than anything else, confused, because we all believed in Oslo. Even those people who were against Oslo believed in Oslo. But I think most Israelis believed in Oslo because they wanted to believe in Oslo. They had good reason to believe in Oslo. There was a time when both Prime Ministers Netanyahu and Prime Minister Barak used their personal attorneys to conduct the negotiations. Attorneys Yitzhak Molcho and Gilad Sher were the chief negotiators. So the impression was that the agreement is there. It's really for the lawyers to finish, to finalize somehow, you know, but the agreement is there. And I think this was one of the major mistakes of the Oslo process. To me, I would go back to Oslo tomorrow morning. I think that Oslo was the best chance we ever had to reach a settlement. Oslo was not wrong. Oslo was mismanaged. A number of mistakes led to the failure of Oslo. And I think the first mistake was that we in Israel never realized or never paid attention to the fact that most Palestinians gain absolutely nothing from Oslo. They have nothing to gain from Oslo. On the contrary, they were put under the corrupt and inefficient oligarchy headed by Yasser Arafat, which to many of them was worse. For example, in terms of human rights. To be a prisoner in a Palestinian jail is worse than to be a Palestinian prisoner in an Israeli jail. And to be a Palestinian prisoner in an Israeli jail is bad enough. But in terms of human rights, in terms of efficiency, in terms of services to the population, the situation became worse. And we never realized that. We never cared for the Palestinians. And I think we should have paid much more, we should have made a much greater effort to incorporate more Palestinians into the process. Because what the Palestinians need more than anything else, and what the process needs more than anything else, is something to lose. The Palestinians need to gain something. They need to have something to lose. Otherwise, there's no chance that anything will ever come to anything. The second big mistake, I think, was made by the whole world, including the United States, Europe, Japan. They gave the Palestinians billions and billions of dollars and never ever told them what to do with the money. Now again, this is politically correct. You respect the people, you respect their ability to see for their own needs. Well, that was wrong. Because what happened was that instead of buying 50,000 computers, he bought 50,000 guns. He created, as I said, this small oligarchy of people around him, about 250,000 people. Half of them wear uniforms and carry guns, and the majority of the population gained absolutely nothing. One of the big mysteries of those years is, where is all the money? Where has all the money gone? Millions and millions, billions of dollars. And they disappeared somehow. Nobody really knows what the Palestinians ever did with it. During one of the raids, I think, on Jenin, the Israeli raids on Jenin, the Palestinians claimed that Israel is destroying their social infrastructure. Unfortunately, there was not much to destroy. There is no infrastructure. There is no housing, there is no schooling, there is no health system, there is nothing. So the Palestinians blame Israel, and Israel indeed does bear some of the responsibility for the situation, but they wasted time and they wasted money, and we never paid attention to it. And that was, I think, one major reason why the Oslo process failed. In addition to that, we continued to send Israelis to live on the occupied territories. We established new settlements, and we increased the number of Israelis who live in existing settlements. Now, this is one thing you can't do. If you go for an agreement with the Palestinians, you can't add Israeli settlements on the territory. It goes one or the other. And that contradiction contributed a great deal to the failure of Oslo. Also, the whole negotiations were always conducted secretly, which turned out to be a big mistake. Diplomacy is usually conducted secretly, but that was a big mistake because the leaders, both Palestinian leaders and Israeli leaders, never prepared the public for the kind of things they would have to give up. They were never prepared. One day, the Palestinians hear that they are supposed to sign a final peace settlement. They were never prepared for it. One day, Israelis hear that they are supposed to give up some rights in Jerusalem. They were never prepared for it. So that, I think, was a big psychological mistake. Then, as you know, Rabin was assassinated, and that was not good for peace, and Netanyahu was elected, and that was not good for peace. And then Barak was elected, and that was also not good for peace. Barak meant well, but I think that we know enough by now to know that the myth which he is spreading, as if he offered the Palestinians everything he could offer and the Palestinians rejected it, that is indeed not the case. I think that the big mistake of Barak was that he tried to impose on the Palestinians a final settlement. That is part, I think, of Barak's Napoleonic megalomania. He decided, I will be peacemaker, and I will impose on the Palestinians a final peace. And I will do that 10 days before the general elections in Israel. This is not the way things work. It doesn't work that way because many problems, many elements of the conflict don't have a solution at this time. We don't have a solution at this time to the problem of the Palestinian refugees. They want to come back, they cannot come back, hence we have no solution at this time. We have no solution to the settlement problem. Yes, we can dismantle some, we can take out settlers, but that is not enough for the Palestinians. So we don't have a problem. We don't have a solution to that problem. We don't have a solution to the Jerusalem problem. Jerusalem has been a problem for the last 3,000 years, and it may well remain a problem for the next 3,000 years. So it is really not about solving these issues. It is about managing these issues. It is all about management. Oslo was all about management. Oslo was based on the assumption that the conflict does not have a solution at this time. It can be managed in a rational way. Partial solutions can be found. Regional settlements, lots of things can be done. Life can be better, but the conflict cannot be solved at this time. Managing the conflict is exactly what Amram Mitzna, the mayor of Haifa and Sharon's opponent in this election, suggested. Unlike Barak, he did not promise to solve the conflict. He promised to manage it. He promised to manage it very much in the sense of Rabin. For example, he said, I will conduct negotiations with the Palestinians as if there is no terrorism, and I will fight terrorism as if we are not negotiating. This is the formula of Rabin. He suggested to dismantle some of the Israeli settlements, including all Israeli settlements in Gaza. These are very, very small, I can't even say communities. Maybe in America you call community even those very small. These are very, very small, isolated places. And if you dismantle them and bring the people back home or make them join other larger areas of settlement, the Zionist ideology will not even remember, Zionist history will not even remember that they were ever there. They are causing hardship, they are causing animosity, they are causing tension. They have no justification and no reason, other than sentimental reasons, national reasons, so-called patriotic reasons. Mitzna said, let's dismantle them. Mitzna is actually a good man. For the first time in 2 years, he offered the Israelis a clear alternative to the policies of the government. He said, let's manage the conflict. It's a very rational and very reasonable approach, and I think this is the main problem with his approach. It was too rational, it was too reasonable, because after 2 years of terrorism, Israelis were not able to listen to cold analysis, rational analysis, such as coming from Mitzna. Israelis are confused, Israelis are angry, Israelis, particularly those who believed in Oslo, they they have a hard time to realize that Oslo was an illusion. Even those people who support the Israeli peace movement are very confused, with good reason. You know, you sit with leftist friends like yourself in a cafe, you discuss peace, you discuss Palestinians, you discuss human rights, you discuss dismantlement of settlements, you discuss the establishment of a Palestinian state. If you're lucky, the cafe doesn't blow up while you are there, but only the next day when you have left. And so you feel stupid. You feel that there is really nothing to do. The situation is stronger than your good wishes and well-wishing views. So Israelis are confused, as I said, and angry and frightened. And yes, they are also hateful. They voted for Sharon because they needed a strong fist to hit at the Palestinians. Not because they think that hitting the Palestinians is solving the problem, not because they don't know that nowhere or almost nowhere in modern times has any terrorist problem been solved by military means. There is no military solution to terrorism. They know that. And still, they voted Sharon because they wanted to punish the Palestinians, they wanted to punish Arafat. And I was asked this morning why I'm using the word punishment. Maybe it is too harsh. No, I'm using the word punishment in order to avoid the word revenge. This was a very, very hard time in Israel. And people, many people, wanted revenge. They voted Sharon in order to revenge. Now, I think that those of you who may be engaged in the study of the effect of terrorism might find this a good case for the study of how, for the sociological and psychological effects of terrorism on a democratic country. It is very harmful. Terrorism is very harmful. Somebody said in Israel, terrorism is voting Sharon. You might also say terrorism is voting anti-democracy. And so, for the first time in our history, we had a very large number of people who did not go to vote at all. That is a new thing for us. We are a very political society. We have a very high percentage of votage. This time we had the lowest number in the history of the country, 61% only. And many people voted for a very strange party, a middle-of-the-road party called Shinui, which is not a real party at all. It is a mood. It is a group that reflects a certain mood, a mood of confusion. And it reflects hatred against the ultra-Orthodox, Sephardic ultra-Orthodox people in Israel. So some people found an outlet to their hatred among the rows of that party, but most people, but this is, for example, a party that doesn't have a clear answer to the Palestinian problem. They're not concerned with the Palestinian problem. They hate the religious people, they hate the Orthodox people, that's all they have to say. And many people went for that party, again, as a sign of confusion. You don't really know, do you vote for Sharon, do you vote for Labor, where do you go? Or many people actually left Labor and went to Shinui. Not so much out of a clear analysis again, but out of emotion. And you find signs in Israel that we are going backwards. For those people who had seen and analyzed and talked about the post-Zionist situation, they find that Israel is going backwards. We find ourselves again in some kind of closed tribal atmosphere where we believe that the whole world is against us and where most of us believe that we should hold together, meaning that a majority of Israelis want a national unity cabinet once again because they feel that the country is threatened. They don't really know by what, but they feel threatened personally, not the country is, but they feel that the Palestinian threat requires unity, and so they want to go for national unity again. Again, a good reason to vote for Sharon, because Sharon advocated national unity. Labour said they won't join Sharon. And you find ugly signs in Israel. You find the streets of Jerusalem covered with black graffiti saying death to the Arabs. All walls of Jerusalem are covered with black graffitis now saying death to the Arabs. You can understand where it comes from, but still it's very ugly. And the municipality doesn't even bother to clean the walls, because as soon as they clean it off, it appears again. So that's a bad sign. And of course, you don't hear of any, or almost of any, protest about the oppression measures of Israel on the occupied territories. The situation of the Palestinians is quite terrible, and we don't hear much about it. There are places with 70% of unemployment among the Palestinians. And the occupation policies of Israel are very harsh. And the systematic violation of human rights is not always necessary. But you don't hear much about it. There is hardly any protest. Another indication, a recent indication of the bad mood in Israel is that many Israelis are lining up in front of foreign embassies and asking to take out foreign passports, which is now possible according to people whose parents come from Europe can now get European passports. Believe it or not, there live in Israel not less than 100,000 Israelis who carry German passports, which means that they all went to the German embassy and asked for German passports, because that's the easiest one you can get. If your parents came from Germany, it's very easy, you get a German passport. You might take it on the optimistic side and say, okay, they don't leave Israel. In 1967, we had a similar situation where terrorism was combined with economic hardship. Thousands and thousands of Israelis left Israel. We don't have that today. But still, I think it is a very interesting phenomenon that so many thousands of Israelis feel that it's a good thing to have a European passport. I don't leave Israel. Maybe it's only for the children. The children may want to study in Europe, they can work in Europe. It's a good thing to have. Let's have another passport. It's also a very Jewish kind of thing, I think, to have, you know, to be able to immigrate, or to know that you may need one day to live in another country. And so we have that phenomena. And summing up, I am actually telling you a very sad story about a very bad situation in Israel. The situation is bad objectively, the mood is bad, and I think that this is what you can learn from the election results. Now, I am a journalist, and I hardly know what happened the day before. I don't know what will happen tomorrow. I have a feeling that as long as Sharon is Prime Minister of Israel, and as long as Arafat is there, nothing can change. Because these two people are very old people, are old people, and maybe not so in age, but these are people who have been in politics for many years, for 30 and 40 years. And they are stuck in their heroic past as fighters. Sharon is a warrior, a soldier. His major enemy are the Palestinians. And Arafat is the man who institutionalized and symbolized and led the Palestinian struggle of terrorism. Arafat is stuck in the days, his heroic days, when the Palestinians hijacked planes. So these are not people who can meet each other and reach an agreement. In fact, they live 20 minutes away from each other, and they have never met since Sharon became Prime Minister. It's a 20 minutes drive from Ramallah to Jerusalem. I have seen Arafat twice since he who came under house arrest. The first time was a very long conversation over lunch, like a 3-hour conversation. And the second time was much shorter when the headquarters were already destroyed. Both times I had the feeling that, yes, he is irrelevant. I mean, this is what Sharon has done to him. This is what Sharon says, and I think it is true. Arafat is irrelevant. But still, as long as he is there, he is a very, very powerful national symbol. He does not control the affairs. He does not control the terrorists, but he is a very, very powerful symbol. And as long as he is there, I think that nothing can change. Who will replace him? That always comes as a question. Give us names. There are some names, but I think that once he disappears, you will see people coming up. The politician who does not have a replacement has not yet been born. It's a natural phenomenon. He will have a replacement, and I think that his replacement will be much more rational and much less ambitious. And a similar leadership will emerge in Israel after Sharon. Mitzna, as I said, is a much less ambitious person. Now, having said all that, I think I want to share with you, finally, I want to share with you an historical thought. There was a time when the Arabs in general and the Palestinians in particular refused to recognize Israel. In the meantime, we have signed 2 peace agreements, one with Egypt and one with Jordan. We have exchanged ambassadors. They are still there. The Palestinians at one time said that the Jews have no place in Israel. All those Jews who came to Israel after 1917 should go back to their countries. They then advocated an idea which they called a secular democratic state, really meaning some kind of binational entity in which the Jews would have no majority. Eventually, they recognized the state of Israel in the boundaries of 1967. This is what they say now. So they have come quite a way. We in Israel once had a prime minister, whom many of you may remember, called Golda Meir, and she said there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. She refused to recognize the existence of a Palestinian people. There was a time when we said we will never ever talk to the PLO. In fact, it was illegal to talk to the PLO, and some Israeli peace activists were put in jail for talking to members of the PLO. We did talk to the PLO. We said we will never ever withdraw from any territory unless in the framework of a final peace agreement. And we did. In the meantime, we have reoccupied some of these territories, but the principle was set. We said we will never ever agree to the establishment of a Palestinian state. Today, even Prime Minister Sharon says that he advocates some kind of Palestinian state. We said we will never ever even negotiate the status of Jerusalem. And Barak did, breaking a sacred taboo. It did not lead anywhere, but the taboo, at least, was broken. So I think that when you think of the situation historically, you can see signs for approachment. We are coming closer. It is a very, very slow process. And of course, it has, there are elements which make it more difficult. The settlements make it more difficult. And the fact that the conflict becomes increasingly religious makes it more difficult, both on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. But still, I think that the fact that the historical development seems to indicate a possibility of settlement is something that days which, like the days of today, are very, very difficult. Now, this to me is a good reason to remain in Israel, because if you don't believe that at one time there might be some kind of settlement, then you might as well settle in Santa Barbara. And I always tell young people that they really have, if they can, they should stay in Israel. My parents have lost their whole world when they were forced out of Germany by the Nazis. And they settled in Palestine, and they never felt at home in Palestine. I'm the son of immigrants who felt, until the end of their days, as refugees. They never really wanted to live in Palestine. What we have today is the beginning of an Israeli routine, which is perhaps the major achievement of Israel, which means that we have a second and third generation of Israelis who speak Hebrew with their parents, go to the same schools as their parents, serve in the same units of the army as their parents, and feel very much at home there. There was a time, some of you who flew to Israel may remember that, there was a time when Israelis flying home, particularly on El Al planes, the moment the plane lands in Tel Aviv, they all start to applaud. Why do they do that? Because they assume that the plane will crash. If it doesn't crash, they have reason to applaud the pilot, and so they applaud the pilot. These days are over. Most Israelis feel at home in Israel. Most Israelis know that Israel is there to stay. And I think that there is a good chance to carry on this chain of Israeli generations. And I also think that there is a good reason to do so. Thank you very much. Yes, of course.
Dr. Segev will take questions, or Tom Segev will take questions. And the way that we'd like to do this is that in the aisles there are microphones. And what we'd like you to do is, those of you who have questions, to go to those microphones. You may have to take a number. Juan Campo has a number over there. It's number 1. And Sean Landris has number 2. And let me ask, though, so that we can have a spirited discussion with everyone, that we want to keep our questions short, right? Tom, go ahead. Juan?
Okay.
Thank you.
What do I do with the mic now?
You just keep talking.
No, she wants
He
me
can
to...
keep talking, right?
Okay,
You
do
just
I
keep
open it
talking.
or do I... Okay, because I like to walk around while... Is that why you gave me your mic, Jessica? What do I do now with the mic? Is that okay? Can I talk like this now? No. So what do I do? Now. All right. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Tom, so much for your insightful remarks, bringing us right up to the moment, I think, in terms of the situation in Israel and Palestine. One thing that I was curious about, though, and I talked about this with you at brunch, was the presence of the United States in the future, or the post-Arafat and Sharon future of Israel. We have a very complex situation evolving in the Middle East in terms of prospects of war there. More and more, I think, concern both in Israel and in the region as a whole in terms of tensions. What is the perception in Israel with respect to the policy that is being adapted by the United States, or being attempted to be constructed by the United States, both with respect to the current situation in Israel and the Palestinians, but also the impact of a wider conflict in the Middle East might have on that situation?
Israelis take the support of the United States for granted. They believe that it will continue forever. They believe when America says that it guarantees the security of Israel. They tend to not to do things the United States strongly objects to. For example, one of the reasons why Sharon did not expel Arafat was because President Bush told him don't. There's one other reason why he didn't, because the Israeli security organizations believe that it is a bad idea to expel Arafat. He will do more harm traveling around the world and talking Palestinian politics than being held under house arrest in Ramallah. And so, this is also true historically, except for two major chapters in Israeli history. One is the development of our nuclear capacity, which was done against the wishes of the United States back in the 60s, and the other is the settlement policy. We are settling the occupied territories in spite of the fact that America tells us not to. But we take American support for granted. We tend in Israel to support the war policy of President Bush today, but I think that most Israelis would like the war to be very, very short and very, very successful. They are afraid of the war, but they are also afraid of Saddam Hussein. And it is difficult to say what they are more afraid of. So we do not belong to those people in the world who object in principle to the war plans of Bush, but we feel that we might be the first victims of that war. And that's why many people will not be sad if some other solution be found. I think this is summing up. Many people in Israel, I think most people in Israel, very, very much appreciated the very deep involvement of President Clinton in the Middle East, and were unhappy about the original tendency of Bush to ignore the Middle East, as if he has nothing to do there, particularly because he did actually two things. He supported Sharon, and he said, it's none of my business. So many people in Israel felt betrayed. They thought that the United States should have a deeper involvement in the Middle East. And I think that many people, you will hear many Israelis tell you that, especially those who support leftist views, who will tell you that once the war with Iraq is over, Bush will be more deeply involved with Israel, which is not based on any knowledge or analysis. It's based on, again, some gut feeling and maybe some hope.
My question is about the elections and the next steps. My understanding is that Sharon would like a unity government or a government of parties that would endorse the roadmap. Mitzna doesn't want to sit with Sharon, Lapid won't sit with Shas, and NRP and UTJ yesterday or today announced that they are opposed to the roadmap. Given that, my question is, are there any combinations that you think could lead to the formation of a government that would last any length of time? And if there are, would that government have a mandate to do anything? And if so, what?
It is very possible that the new government will be very weak. Some people are even talking about new elections. But theoretically, on paper, Sharon has, in fact, a variety of possibilities, and he can form a cabinet with the right-wing parties. He can do it with the right-wing parties and Shinui, and he can do Shinui and Labor, if Labor joins him. I think the most important thing at the moment is to remember that Sharon is in no hurry. According to the Israeli law, he has about 30 days yet to work it out. He's waiting for the spirits to cool off a little bit. Politicians who, until recently, were in government may rethink their promise not to join the promise they gave before the elections. The situation in Iraq may create an atmosphere of national emergency, and then Labor might say, okay, well, this is a new situation and we join the government anyway. There are a number of possibilities. I don't think that we don't have a government. It's not a situation where the country has become impossible to rule. So it's really the problems of a rich man Sharon has. He has to choose from a number of possibilities. And I don't really know what he will do. But these are the possibilities.
Early in your talk today, you mentioned how the Israeli election perhaps was evidence of the population voting with their guts instead of their head. And in the article in the paper here on Friday, you said essentially the same thing, that it was a passionate decision rather than a rational one. And you went on to say that this is what terrorism has done to a lot of countries like the United States.
I'm sorry?
That sort of thinking, terrorism has forced that sort of thinking in other rational democracies like the United States. We can all think of a couple of examples of that, but I was just wondering what several examples you might have been thinking of where the United States decision-making has been passionate instead of rational, and what that might bode for
I was thinking about the immediate reaction to September 11th. In fact, I wrote an article for the New York Times in which I talked about the Israelization of America, because you had initially very Israeli reaction to September 11th. The helplessness, the feeling that the whole world is against you, the refusal to think, well, why do these people do that to us? They do that because they hate us and there's no other question. And of course, the initial plans to take measures which contradict freedom of the speech and freedom of movement and other democratic liberties, which is a very natural and instinctive reaction to terrorism. And we have the same kind of reactions in Israel. So I thought I kind of detect a very Israeli reaction to something which you had not experienced to that extent before, and we in Israel had. This is why I thought that I can understand your reaction to September 11th, the patriotism, the flags, the need to be together, the tendency of people to be nice to each other all of a sudden, nicer than they would usually be, all of the fear, the anger, the hatred, all of those things which we had experienced in Israel before. And I was also thinking one thing which, the hero making, for example, the speed in which the firefighters became new heroes. We have the same kind of tendency in Israel. So all these things I thought are very interesting. And I was on September, I arrived in America on September 10th, and I was to teach a course at Rutgers University on Israeli culture, and I had one student called, his last name was Awad, so I would think that he comes from Arab origin, and he one day told me that he can no longer come to classes because he has been called to the reserves in the National Guard, and he felt very strongly about it. And I thought this is a very Israeli situation where a student comes to the professor, says, I was called to the reserves, to Miluim, and I asked John Awad, what are you doing in the reserves? And he said, I'm not free to talk about it. So he probably guards a bridge or something. And I also thought this is a very Israeli kind of situation. So this is why I thought. But this is a very dangerous thing for a democratic society. And I think the elections in Israel should worry people regardless of whether you support Sharon or not, because it does not reflect clear thinking. It does not reflect the rational decision. It reflects a gut reaction to, as I said, out of very strong passions.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, you mentioned that it was a myth that Barak offered land for peace.
Yes.
And many Americans questioned the judgment of the Palestinians to reject this offer, that they were offered 90-something% of the West Bank. And I was wondering if you could expound upon that, why you didn't think it was a legitimate offer for the Palestinians. And second, many friends I have who are not anti-Israel, but they question the amount of money that the U.S. gives to Israel. And I don't always have an answer to give them the amount of money that the United States gives to Egypt, other Arab states, and other non-Arab states. Do you have any notion of
I'm not
the
sure I
balance of
understand
money?
the second question. I'm sorry.
The second question is that some friends have said to me that they don't understand the United States giving
Oh,
such
why is it
vast
that the
amounts of
United
money to
States is
Israel.
supporting Israel?
And my answer is, I think we give a lot of money to Arab states and other countries.
Yes.
Do you know where it? Thank you.
What was the first question? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The myth of Barak, yes. I think the problem with Camp David and Barak is that we know really very little what happened there. All the participants tell us what happened. They are all right. They all have papers and they all write memoirs. Or if they don't write memoirs, they have journalists who interview them and get their versions out. We don't really know what actually happened in Camp David. What is it that we actually offered and what is it that the Palestinians actually rejected? We just don't really know. And that is very difficult because both sides are using Camp David as a propaganda tool. I was, as I said, I had lunch with Arafat. I was sitting next to him. Naturally, I asked him, so what went wrong in Camp David? And he said, oh, we were that close. Now, this is a very interesting body language because it is exactly what Barak says. He says, we were that close. So if you were that close, what happened? And Arafat said, oh, we had a solution to everything. Well, that's very nice. So how did you solve the refugee problem? And he said, oh, no problem at all, according to UN resolutions. Well, only that Israel doesn't accept them, right? UN resolutions, meaning that the Palestinians can choose between returning or so that's not a good solution. How did you solve the settlement problem, I asked him, and he said, oh, no problem at all. The settlers can all remain as Palestinian citizens, equal citizens in a Palestinian state. Well, that's not what the settlement is all about. So you did not really solve it. And then how did you solve the problem of Jerusalem? He says, this was the problem. Because Barak wouldn't give us sovereignty on the Temple Mount, this was the only problem. If he had given us this, everything else we would have solved. Well, I don't really believe that. First of all, he cannot do that. And secondly, well, how do you solve the rest of it? I mean, the magnitude of the problems is such that it goes much beyond diplomatic papers. And therefore, I think that, but as I said, I think that what Barak tried to do in Camp David was to impose on Arafat a final peace settlement, meaning that Arafat would accept whatever he accepts, whatever he gets, which is much less than he can accept. I mean, I'm not saying whether he was right or wrong, whether it was clever or not clever, moral or immoral. He cannot accept it politically. And Barak tried to impose on him a settlement, which he, from a political point of view, cannot accept. He cannot look into the eyes of 3 million refugees and tell them the conflict with Israel is over. Because for the refugees, it is not an abstract diplomatic problem of diplomatic history. It's a very real problem. They wake up in the morning and they look out of the window and they see streets which are so narrow that two people can't walk next to each other. They are in a very deplorable situation. Being a refugee is a real situation to them. So why would they agree that the conflict with Israel is over? No, they want to fight forever until they get back their houses in Haifa. So that's not the way to solve the problem, make them sign a paper. And why, it's also very strange, why would you trust a paper Arafat signs? I mean, what is it to you? It means to him only because the timing, 3 days before the Israeli election, that was the importance for Barak. Because Barak is not a statesman. He's not like Rabin. He's also not as dovish as Rabin was. And Rabin was not head of the Israeli peace movement. So all these statements saying we offered them everything and they rejected everything, it's not as simple as that. I was never able to really understand why the United States is so constantly and so passionately, you might always say, support Israel. I was never really able to understand that, and I think that you have a problem explaining that to your friend. I think the best way to explain this to your friend is to say, because a large majority of Americans want the government to support Israel. There's a very, very large popular support for Israel in the American public, and since it is a democratic country, that's the way it's done. But what the real interest is here, I was never able to understand, and I think that perhaps a future historian might say there was no real interest. It was really based on some kind of feeling or I don't really know. I know why the United States supported Israel, let's say, in 1967 or in 1966. They gave us a lot of weapons, hoping that we will not develop our own atomic bomb. And we did so anyway. So why they are supporting us today with so much money? Because Americans think that it's a good investment or it's a good cause to spend money. Once that changes, they will not do that anymore. So I think this is the best answer you can give your friend. I don't really have a good, and I know that many people have tried to come up with deeper answers. Why the involvement of the United States with Israel, particularly now where they are not competing with the Soviet Union anymore. So it's not an easy thing to explain.
I want to thank you for making my days full with the 7th million. I've been reading it as a Holocaust survivor.
Thank you.
You're making history alive for me day by day as I'm down already to the last pages. I have a question that has always bothered me. One of the questions is the educational system. I have been to Israel 5 times. I have spoken at Kfar Vradim, to that little village, the high school, and I couldn't understand that there were no Arab students. I asked my friend who teaches there, and he said completely different systems.
Yes.
And it bothered me. Second question that I have, and it's really been on my mind a lot when I read the news, is what's happening to Israeli Arabs, namely the Christian Arabs who are living in the Green Line, what's happening, what's being doing, what all this is happening, and also important, I want to know, how did the vote go? Did they vote?
Yes, they voted. Many of them abstained from voting, as they did in the Jewish sectors. But this time, many of them went to vote, unlike the previous time when we had a particular problem with a kind of protest abstention. This time, they did go to vote. Most of them voted for Arab nationalist, Israeli Arab nationalist parties, and they are represented in the Knesset by these Arab nationalist parties. I think this is a very long and complicated subject, but I think I will give you, I will do justice to the subject if I tell you that a very large majority of Israeli Arabs want nothing more than to be recognized as equal Israeli citizens, and they are not. They are recognized by law as equal Israeli citizens, but they are discriminated against on a number of fields, and they feel very strongly that they have a right to be regarded as equal Israeli citizens. I also happen to think that this is a ticking time bomb, because if we don't, then a younger generation of Israeli Arabs might feel, well, this is not really my country, and many of them already do. This is not really my country, and they will make one hand with the Palestinians, and this will be very, very, very harmful for the Israeli democracy. So I don't think that we have reached that point yet, and I think that the whole discussion of how to keep Israel Jewish and democratic, as I said, is really about that. It was began to be a very fruitful discussion, but of course, once you have war with the Palestinians, terrorism with the Palestinians, it's very, very difficult to conduct such a discussion and take up the problem. But this is a major problem in Israel and a very dangerous problem, potentially very dangerous.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You mentioned one of the things that was disconcerting to you was the lack of a peace movement within a viable peace movement within Israeli society. And when I was there last year, there was a rally at Rabin Square with tens of thousands of people,
yes,
pro-peace. And on the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway, there's a huge billboard in Arabic, Hebrew, and English that says, "Better to have pains of peace than something of war." I don't know exactly. So I didn't notice. Perhaps in the last 6 months, it's deteriorated even further. My What is disconcerting to me has always been a complete lack of a peace movement within the Palestinian world, and I don't hear any voice for peace. In fact, it seems that the closest thing we have to a peace movement in the Palestinian territories is Fatah, who, while they go to Egypt and tell Hamas not to do terrorist attacks, they're shooting Israelis. So if that's the closest thing that there is to a peace movement, isn't that a bigger problem? And that leads me to the next question, which is, what is it that makes you think that Arafat's successor, or Arafat's rather replacement, would be someone more rational when Hamas seems to be the second most popular political movement within the territories? And what would happen if the successor of Arafat was the leader of Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and where would that put things?
It will be very bad. But let's take one at a time. It's not that there is a complete lack of peace movement. Meretz is the political organization, Meretz party, and they lost a lot of votes. Labor represents the peace movement, and they lost a lot of votes. So it's not that it's all gone. Also some small, very radical peace movements, radical not in the sense of that they are resorting to violence, but that they are very vehemently believing in the cause of peace, they still exist. Only their voice is very weak. The second time I went to see Arafat, as I mentioned that I saw him twice since his arrest, I went with a group of Israelis who have lost their children in terrorist attacks. They have formed a group together with Palestinians who lost their sons in the Intifada. On that day, the Palestinians had gone to the Hadassah hospital, which is on the Israeli side of Jerusalem, to donate blood. And the Israelis went to Ramallah to donate blood to the Palestinians. I mean, more symbolic you can't get than actually donating your blood, being somebody whose son was killed by Palestinian terrorists, actually to go there and donate blood. It did not make big headlines in Israel. It made big headlines here. There's a story today, I think, in the LA Times about a similar group that works in Los Angeles, or about an exhibition or some project between Jews and Arabs who share. Israelis and Palestinians who work in LA, I think. So it's not that they don't exist at all, but they are very, very weak. And I try to explain to you why they are so weak, because they also feel personally threatened. That's a difference between the present Intifada and the previous Intifada. The previous Intifada happened mostly on the occupied territories. This was presented to many people in Israel as a people struggling for freedom, to get rid of a foreign occupier, and many Israelis sympathized with that, and that is in fact what led to Oslo. The first Intifada, you might say, won. The second Intifada, the present Intifada, does not happen on the territories mostly. It happens mostly with us. It happens with people who, yes, belong to the Hamas, and they are religious fanatics, or the jihad, the people who blow themselves up in the midst of our towns, and there's nothing to tell them. This is what causes so much, makes people so depressed and desperate, even on the peace camp. I have nothing to tell somebody who blows himself up in Tel Aviv, because he won't listen to reason. And this is what the religion does to the conflict. It does the same on the Israeli side. The Jewish fanaticism has become much stronger in the past years. The settler somewhere in Hebron, not all settlers, but those settlers who sit in Hebron, they are guided by the same God that guides the Palestinian suicide bomber. It's the very same thing. There is no reason, nothing I can tell him will convince him to get out of Hebron. So this is why when you say what will happen if Hamas or Jihad becomes leader of the Palestinians, it will be very bad, because there is no basis for discussion. I don't really see this happening. There are a number of people under Arafat who are very reasonable people, who just don't dare to speak up as long as he is there, which is why first he has to go. He casts a giant shadow on a whole group of people who might be, unlike Arafat, not larger than life. They would just be ordinary politicians. They will be pragmatic. They will see that, you know, it's time to get this part of the world, making it livable again. And they might do that. I mean, it's reasonable to assume that after Arafat, some more rational people will come to power.
You know, I have a number of my friends in line here to ask questions, but we only have time for one more. I know that, and I'd like to invite Professor Lisa Hajar to ask the last question. You know, some of my good friends there on the other side, and, but is that all right? I'm sorry. Professor Hajar.
Thank you. Over the last couple of years, both the far left and the far right in Israel have been talking increasingly about transfer, of course, for very different reasons. And by transfer, I would be, you know, sort of the code word for ethnic cleansing. The left to ring the warning bells that this might be a possibility, and the right saying that this is actually the solution to the current stalemate. And this this whole discourse, especially on the left, has become increasingly intense since the fall, with this, you know, the build-up to war in Iraq, and the fear that this might actually be something that would happen, either a wholesale type of transfer or possibly selective types of transfer under the cover of war, or internal transfer, moving Palestinians, concentrating them possibly in towns. If you could speak about whether or not that's a realistic scenario in your opinion, and also if there were to be any type of scenario of transfer instituted in the coming year or two, what do you imagine would be the response by important sectors of Israel, the courts and left organizations and so on?
I mentioned to you that the streets of Jerusalem, the houses are covered these days by black graffiti saying death to the Arabs. There are also graffiti saying let's expel the Arabs, or transfer means security, or transfer means peace, or transfer now. Transfer population in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really means the expulsion of Arabs. Those people who advocate the idea argue only whether we should expel only the Palestinians who live on the occupied territories, or whether we should also expel all or part of the Israeli Arabs, Israeli citizens, how we should do that. Now, the fact that this idea has become a legitimate topic of discussion is perhaps the ugliest and most worrisome indication of how passion has come to dominate the political discourse in Israel, because the idea of population transfer in various forms is part of the central thought of the Zionist ideology, and has been part of the Zionist ideology for many, many years. So it's not so outrageous. But in modern times, the idea of transfer, or as I said, expelling the Arabs, is something you might find on the inside doors of a public toilet. You will not find it in legitimate public discourse. And over the past years, especially since the assassination of Rehavam Ze'evi, who was the leader of the movement which advocated transfer, this has become a legitimate idea. And I think that this is something that should worry us all. I do not see that any substantial number of Israelis go for that, but the fact that it is legitimate to discuss is in itself something which worries me very much. And the only way I can understand it is that I explain it as another effect Palestinian terrorism has on our ability to keep a sane discussion amongst ourselves. And that is why it worries me very much.
Before we thank Tom Segev, I'd like to point out that his books are on sale in the outside the door of the Corwin Pavilion here. He will sign books. I realize that I'm sort of the person who has to cut the discussion off, but once again, I think we've had a distinguished, wonderful lecture about Israel at the present time. And we're deeply thankful, Tom, for your coming to Santa Barbara and sharing your experience.
Thank you.